Welcome to On Health with Houston Methodist. I'm Zach Moore. I'm a photographer and editor here, and I'm also a longtime podcaster.
I'm Kim Rivera Houston Weber, and I'm a copywriter here at Houston Methodist.
And Kim, do you eat ultra-processed foods?
I mean, it's kind of hard not to, right? They're seemingly everywhere, and they're a huge part of the American diet, for better or worse, I guess.
Yeah, unfortunately. And when you're trying to be healthy, one of the first things that we understand we should try to cut down on, you don't have to totally cut it out of your diet, but try to cut down on, is processed foods. So it just stands to reason you really want to cut out ultra-processed foods, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think the delineation of what's ultra-processed versus what's processed or minimally processed, there's a lot of blurred lines there.
Mm-hmm.
And a contributing factor to it is like you see all of this stuff online. At least in my feed,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's always some person who's not a registered dietitian, not a food scientist, that are pointing at some food label and they're saying, if you're eating X ingredient, you're poisoning yourself. And then they'll go to a big box store and they'll say, like, here it is.
Yeah.
And you start to think, am I poisoning myself? But then also, it's been a long time since I've done even high school chemistry. So, I'm not the best judge. So I'm really excited for your conversation today because there's a lot of nuance to this topic that I think needs to be explored.
Absolutely. So we talked to Amanda Beaver. She is a senior registered dietitian here at Houston Methodist. We've had her on the podcast a few times before. Always a pleasure talking to her and looking forward to what she has to say about ultra-processed foods. Thanks for being back on the podcast with us, Amanda.
Thank you.
Now, ultra-processed foods. Let's start out by defining what those are. What's the difference between an ultra-processed and processed food? And I guess what causes the quote-unquote ultra?
This can be really difficult to pin down. And one thing that I want to say is that processed foods exist on a continuum. So there's not like one hard definition as to what an ultra-processed food is versus a processed food or minimally processed food.
Mm-hmm.
So think about it like a continuum. So an example that you could use is maybe think about like oatmeal, for example, right? You can get the steel cut oats. You can get the quick oats. You can get the little packet that you just add the water to, the instant oats. And then you can also get breakfast cereal that maybe has some oats in it, like a popular marshmallow cereal out there. So, right, that's an example of that continuum of food processing. So researchers and scientists have tried to devise some kind of system to help them know, okay, what is an ultra-processed food, to help them study this topic. So what they've done is they've divided foods into about 4 different categories. So the first category is going to be our unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So this is going to be things that don't have any salt or sugar or oil or colors or flavors or any of that added to them. A piece of fruit, or maybe even frozen vegetables.
Okay.
That's one that I really wanted to highlight in this conversation because so often patients come to me thinking that frozen vegetables are worse for them, but actually they're considered a minimally processed food.
No, I had that same preconceived notion about frozen vegetables.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from, but maybe because it's,
Right.
I mean, it lasts longer, but it's in a freezer. That's a whole other process of it lasting longer than like a can.
Right. I think because it's in a bag and it's in the freezer that we think that it's less healthy for us.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, when it comes to frozen veggies or fruits, usually the fruit or vegetable is washed, chopped up, and then frozen. There's nothing going on there that's going to make it bad for us.
Okay.
And sometimes that freezing process where it stays in the freezer can actually preserve a lot of the nutrients compared to maybe if that food was just sitting out on the shelf for a long time. So it actually can preserve some of the nutrients. So yes, frozen foods are considered a minimally processed food.
All right.
And it's totally okay to eat them. Actually, load up on them. The next category that I wanted to talk about is our processed foods. So these are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to be kind of the middle of that spectrum. And these are going to be things that maybe have a little salt added to them or a little oil or a little sugar. So think things like maybe salted nuts. The nuts, they're a whole food, but they've just got a little salt on them, right, to give them a little flavor. Or maybe think about maybe you're making some veggies and you're going to roast some vegetables, right? You're going to add a little bit of oil and maybe a little pinch of salt to those roasted veggies, right? Or maybe think about some applesauce, right? There might be a little bit of salt added to that, right? So these foods exist somewhere in the middle. Another really great example is something like a canned tuna, right? That can be a really nutritious food, high quality protein, great source of omega-3s, but it does have a little bit of salt added to it, right?
Yeah.
So it's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum.
Okay.
Another one is going to be canned beans. When we look at the ingredient list on canned beans, it's going to be water, salt, and beans, right? Nothing crazy there. So yes, that is a processed food, but it's more in the middle of that spectrum. And it's okay to eat these foods in the processed group, right? Those are going to be, usually they just have between 2 to 3 ingredients in them. And then the last group is our ultra processed foods, right? So we've got kind of these 3 main groups that we're talking about here. And the ultra processed foods, this is the category that is really linked with some of the worst health outcomes. So these foods tend to have ingredient lists that are 4 ingredients or longer. And they tend to have things like added sugars, maybe high fructose corn syrup, maybe added colors. Think maybe red dyes or, those other kind of buzzword ingredients we hear about.
Right.
Also preservatives, stabilizers, thickeners, gels, emulsifiers, all these different ingredients added to them that make them considered ultra processed. And these foods tend to be our most convenience items, right? Things like our frozen pizzas or our hot dogs, or maybe even our cookies, our packaged cookies, or our instant noodles. And then a lot of our breakfast cereals as well would fall into this category too.
That's a shame, right? We didn't grow up eating breakfast cereal.
Right, but not all cereals are considered ultra processed. You can find some that are more in that middle end of the spectrum that I was just talking about.
Yeah, I think we all know which ones might be healthier than others.
Right,
So.
It's usually fairly easy to tell. So think about those 3 categories: our minimally processed or unprocessed, right? Our fruits, our veggies, our proteins, our whole raw nuts. And then our ones in the middle, which will be like maybe our salted nuts or maybe our canned beans or our canned tomatoes. And then the last group, which is that ultra processed group.
Got it. So I've read that in the United States, more than half of our energy intake comes from ultra processed foods. This is not ideal, right?
Yeah. So when we look at the research on ultra processed foods, we found that people who tend to eat more ultra processed foods have a higher risk of having low HDL. That's our good cholesterol, right? We want that one to be a little higher. They're also at a higher risk of weight gain. And then lastly, a higher risk of metabolic syndrome, which is basically just higher weight, higher cholesterol, triglycerides, high blood sugar. So the last thing that I want to say, people who are at the highest end of intake for these ultra processed foods, people who eat the most ultra processed foods, tend to have a higher risk of all causes of death. Also a higher risk of heart disease and stroke and even depression. So we do know that there's something about these ultra processed foods that are linked with poor health. But this just shows a relationship, right? This just shows that these foods are linked with these conditions. Recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was an amazing study that was done on ultra processed foods versus minimally processed foods. And this study took 10 men and 10 women, and they put them on a ultra processed diet for 2 weeks and then a minimally processed diet for 2 weeks. And they looked at a bunch of different factors. So to give you some examples of some of the foods that they put these people on, in the minimally processed diet that they were having for 2 weeks, they might have maybe some roasted salmon and roasted veggies, right? Maybe with some rice or quinoa. And then on one of the ultra processed weeks, maybe they had some frozen enchiladas with maybe a soda on the side.
Oh man, it's Yeah, I've eaten a lot of those in my time. Yeah, I hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
But we see that there's a big difference between those. But here's the thing. They made sure that the meals in the ultra processed versus the minimally processed had the same amount of calories, the same amount of protein, same amount of fiber, same carb, same fat. So these, all things considered, were technically nutritionally equal.
Right.
So theoretically, you'd think there probably wouldn't be a difference in their weight gain or their health outcomes, but there was.
Okay.
So at the end of the study, what researchers found was that the people eating the minimally processed food, those who are getting for breakfast maybe yogurt with nuts and fruit, and maybe salmon with roasted veggies, and maybe some rice or quinoa, those individuals lost on average about 2 pounds. They were only doing this for 2 weeks, and they were not instructed to eat less. They were instructed to eat however much they wanted.
Okay.
And then those eating the ultra processed foods, maybe they were getting breakfast cereals or pastries or muffins for breakfast, and then eating the, frozen entrees for dinner. Even though the calories were equal, at the end of the study, they gained an average of 2 pounds.
Oh, wow.
Even though the calories and the nutrition were equal for both. So what this tells us is there really is something about these ultra-processed foods that are leading to weight gain in people, and something about them that is making them contribute to more of these chronic diseases that are linked to weight gain.
The trap of just counting the calories can really throw you off course sometimes. You're like, oh, well, I have 400 left today to give. I can eat these frozen enchiladas. And It's like, oh, no, go for the roasted salmon, right? Even though it's, I think we all know deep down that what's healthier and what's less healthy, right?
Right. We do. But there's one thing I think that a lot of people, when they look at a food label, right, they might be like, okay, this meal has 400 calories. And this meal that's maybe, the salmon and veggies and rice also has 400 calories. One is a lot more processed than the other. Shouldn't they impact my weight and my health equally? The answer that this study tells us is actually no. They actually impact us a lot differently, even though the calories might be equal.
Right.
And there's a few reasons why. So the very first reason is that with these ultra-processed foods, they tend to be more calorie dense. So what I mean by that is there's a higher amount of calories in a smaller volume of food. So compare maybe like a cup of juice to a cup of watermelon, right? That juice is going to be more dense and rich in calories. It doesn't have as much of the fiber and the water and stuff in it.
Right.
So we can't eat as great of a volume, right? If it's an ultra processed food, because it's more calorie dense. Another reason is that, and this is what they actually saw in the study, is that people tend to eat ultra processed foods faster.
Yeah.
So what might be happening is maybe our brain isn't catching up with our fullness, right? We might not realize when we're getting full. Think about when you're eating, a piece of chicken and some veggies, you got to cut up that piece of chicken, right? Now compare that to maybe a frozen entree. That's real easy to just kind of scoop it into our mouth, right? Yeah. So we tend to eat these ultra processed foods faster. And because of that, we tend to end up eating more calories worth of these foods.
Yeah.
So back to that study that I was referencing, those participants when they were eating the ultra processed diet, they were eating on average about 500 calories more per day because those foods had a higher calorie density and they could eat them faster. So they were eating more. And then the next reason is one that really blew my mind when I first learned about this. What it says on the food label doesn't necessarily mean it's what our body is going to absorb. So what I mean by that is think of an almond, right? That almond, if it's in its whole form, it's got a bunch of fiber in it and it's hard to chew up, right? We got to do some work to chew up that almond.
Yeah.
Compare that to almond butter or peanut butter. The work has been done for us right? It's already been broken down
Okay.
for us.
I see where you're going. Interesting. Okay.
So our body can't absorb all the calories in a whole almond compared to the almond butter or the peanut butter, where it can absorb a lot more of the calories from, because our body's not having to do as hard of work to extract and digest and break down those more ultra processed foods.
Wow, you don't even think about that really, but yeah, the chewing of the almond, like that is energy your body is putting out to absorb it. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And then also, because it has all that fiber in it, we're not going to be able to absorb all the calories in it. What that means is, when we look at the food label, if we're trying to decide, hey, should I have a snack of, peanuts or almonds, or should I do some peanut butter, almond butter? Well, the peanuts and almonds are more minimally processed and ultimately might have less of an impact. We'll absorb a little bit less of the calories in them, but we're still getting, a satisfying snack.
Yeah.
So I think it goes to show that even though there's a food label that says the calories, we don't necessarily absorb all of them in there if it's a minimally processed food.
Okay. Everybody speculates, right? So, is it the preservative? Is it all these things, right? And not necessarily. I mean, it's a factor, but not the factor.
Absolutely. And I think people, when they are talking about ultra processed foods, they assume that the problem is the preservatives or the stabilizers or the colors, which, yes, some of those, might not be the best for us. A lot of them don't really have that much of an impact on us.
Okay.
And where the problem lies is kind of the food as a whole. It's because the calories are a lot more absorbable, and we're going to absorb more of the energy in it. And then the last factor that really differentiates the two, like the minimally processed from the ultra processed, is that ultra processed foods will have a higher impact on our blood sugar. Okay. So we'll get a bigger, faster blood sugar spike when we have a ultra processed food compared to a minimally processed food. So one comparison would be, let's take a look maybe at if you're having a piece of fruit, maybe an apple, and we compare that to a juice, for example. That fiber and that action of chewing up that apple, you're going to digest and absorb the carbohydrates in the apple more slowly, and it's going to have less of a big impact on your blood sugar than drinking the juice, right? You can drink that juice a lot faster, and it's going to be absorbed into your bloodstream more quickly.
I guess applesauce would be in that middle ground there between the two.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, spot on. So to kind of summarize that, these foods, we tend to absorb more of the calories from them. We tend to eat them faster. They tend to be more calorie dense, right? More energy dense. And the last one is they have a bigger impact on our blood sugar, a more faster spike in our blood sugar than a more minimally processed food.
Okay. So how did we end up here with all these ultra processed foods and us eating them so often? I assume it's convenience, price, fast food, for example.
Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why these have started to dominate our diet. Some of them are out of our control. So the biggest reason is that these foods are more shelf stable, right? So they last a lot longer because they've had maybe preservatives added to them to help them last longer. The next reason is that these foods do tend to be lower cost, both for the consumer and the manufacturer. So think things like maybe instant noodles, right? Where those are lower cost and lower quality ingredients, and, an ultra processed food. So cost does play a role. But later, we can talk more about some low cost ideas that are minimally processed. And then the next reason is that these foods are usually aesthetic, right? They're in colorful packaging looks beautiful. Yeah. They're exciting. And this is especially true for kids, right? They're maybe marketed to look really yummy and enticing for us, whether we're adults or kids, I guess. And then the last reason is marketing, right? These food companies are making us think that we need these, that these are going to be easier and better for us. One example that I want to give on this is something like maybe protein chips or protein cookies. Those are marketed to us because, this is going to be good for me. This protein, I need this protein.
Right.
But actually, a more minimally processed snack might be a whole lot better for us. So the marketing is really convincing us that it's a good idea.
Up after the break, more with Amanda about ultra-processed foods and some alternatives you might be able to swap them out for.
From annual checkups to managing chronic conditions, your healthcare should be personalized to you. At Houston Methodist, our primary care doctors provide customized care for you and your family, with more than 40 convenient locations across Greater Houston. We offer a variety of ways to get care, from in-person and virtual appointments to same-day visits when you're sick. Choose your doctor and schedule online at houstonmethodist.org/stayhealthy. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
You mentioned a lot of the potential side effects of ultra-processed foods, poor sleep, anxiety, depression, your metabolism slows down, all sorts of brain, heart, lung issues, stomach issues, right? There's still hope for turning one's diet around before it's too late, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Like, it is never too late. And the place that I really like to start with people is just brainstorming some little swaps that they can make in their diet.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like the easiest one is probably snacks, because those do tend to be the ultra processed foods in our diet, right? Think like the crackers and chips and With our snacks, there's some great options. So we could just swap out, instead of doing our crackers or our chips, we could do our nuts. And it's okay to meet me halfway, and you don't have to do the raw nuts, right? You could get the nuts with a little bit of salt on them. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's meeting me in the middle, right? And you're still going to get a lot of those benefits from the fiber and the nutrients. And you're also not going to get quite as much of a calorie absorption, right? If we're having peanut butter, for example. Not to say that nut butters are bad, right? I'm just using them as an example to talk about how, processed, the kind of processing continuum that can exist with foods.
Right.
So that's the first thing, is make some simple swaps with your snacks. Instead of crackers or chips or pretzels or a granola bar, try doing nuts instead.
Yeah, the granola bar. See, that's a sneakily not as healthy a snack as you think it is, right?
Yeah, right. Because it kind of, they're convenient and fast. However, they are an example of an ultra-processed food. Another simple one is just having fruit. And I think fruit is another one of those foods, just like whole grains, that get kind of demonized for the sugar.
Yeah.
But fruits are as minimally processed as they get, right? And what we know from research is that eating a diet higher in fruits and veggies is linked with so many great health outcomes, even lower risk of type 2 diabetes, which is the main reason people worry about fruits in the first place, right? It's the sugar. Yeah, but it's actually linked with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. So fruits and nuts are really great snack options. And the last one is your meals. So think about what component of your meal is a little bit more processed. So maybe if you're making couscous, for example, with your family, maybe the boxed couscous, maybe instead of that, maybe try to do rice or quinoa, right? And then to flavor it, just put a little pinch of salt and some dried herbs, maybe bay leaf in the pot or the rice cooker. And that's going to be a more minimally processed version of a grain that's going to be more nutritious and better for your health.
And highly processed meats, hot dogs, sausages, deli meats, they seem to be the strongest offenders and have some of the strongest risks for long-term side effects. So it's another strike against fast food there, y'all. But with that in mind, what are some alternative choices for people looking for relatively inexpensive meals, and also ones that they can get where they're in a hurry? Basically a fast food alternative.
Yeah. So with fast food, that is one category where a lot of fast food restaurants nowadays, these foods are made ahead of time, right? They are considered ultra-processed.
I thought they said they don't make it till we order it, though.
Right. Well, it depends on what it is. But, the bun isn't, and the nuggets, a lot of times those are going to be made in advance, packaged in advance. our goal is to try to think of some swaps, right? Some easy, fast, nutritious swaps that are going to be less processed or less ultra processed. So some ideas that I usually recommend to my patients are to try something as simple as breakfast for dinner. This is one of my personal favorites. So all you have to do is scramble 2 eggs, or you can just, cook them sunny side up, and then have some whole grain toast with some avocado. Boom. That meal will probably take you less time than it will take to drive to the fast food restaurant, wait in the line, and get the food.
Especially, with the prices these days. I mean, because fast food used to be, convenience and price. But I think the price is kind of equaled out. So that what you just described, in addition to saving time, is going to save you money.
Right. Absolutely. So that's one really easy meal. And if you don't like avocado toast, you could do something else instead. You could have maybe some beans with it, or maybe...
Who doesn't like avocado toast, though?
Right? I know. Right. Put a little pinch of salt or everything bagel seasoning. So that's a really fast idea, is kind of breakfast for dinner. Eggs. So simple, so inexpensive. And then my other ideas come from inspiration from some of our favorite fast casual restaurants. So think things like making your own burrito bowl. That is so easy to put together. All you need is some canned beans, which we learned, right? Canned beans are just salt, the bean, and the water. Just rinse it and drain it. That'll remove 40% of the sodium. Have it with some rice that you make in a rice cooker or your pot. And then you can add some pico, maybe a little bit of frozen corn that
all sounds very good. I'm going to go home and make a burrito bowl after this, I think.
It's so easy and it's so cheap. And I feel like what makes us want to buy this from a restaurant is usually the guacamole. But you can get some pretty good guacamole from the grocery store.
Okay.
And then my next idea, this is another one that I really love to make, is a poke bowl.
I've recently gotten the poke bowls. I'm a big fan.
Yes.
I have a recent convert to poke bowls. It's good stuff, people.
So refreshing. And it's great for the hot Houston weather.
Yes.
So all you need is rice, and then you need some crisp, crunchy veggies like cucumber. You can buy the carrot already shredded.
See, I like that mentality there, because you know what? It's a big lift. It's a big ask.
Right.
If you're used to getting food somewhere and then have to prepare it yourself. And it's okay to kind of cheat. And
It's
for me
okay.
anyway, I'll pay a little bit extra to have it a little pre-prepared, like a pre-cut like that.
Like the shredded
that's an extra
carrots.
step. The shredded carrots. It may seem like a small thing, but a little step like that can help you more embrace this do-it-yourself at home food, I think.
Absolutely. That's why I love those foods that are more in the middle, right? Like the canned beans, the tuna, even the frozen veggies, which we learned are actually considered a minimally processed food, basically an unprocessed food, right? They're just washed and chopped and frozen. Those are great time savers. So poke bowl, you could put some avocado on that too. For the protein, I like to do edamame that I get in the frozen section and just cook that up in the microwave.
Okay.
And then I like to do it with tuna because it's really easy and inexpensive. But you could do salmon. You could do the raw versions of those if you want to get the sushi grade salmon or tuna. But I like to just use regular canned tuna because it's inexpensive. And then my next idea is a Mediterranean bowl. So this also takes some inspiration from some popular fast casual restaurants that a lot of us can probably think of. So what you're going to do for that is pick your favorite grain. It could be quinoa. It could be rice. And then we're going to put maybe some chickpeas on it, maybe some hummus. And then for the veg, you could do some cucumber, maybe slice up some cherry tomatoes, maybe put a little feta cheese, right? This is sounding really good.
Yes, I'm on board for this.
And it's really easy, right? Because the only thing that you really have to put a little bit more effort into is the protein. The next idea is doing something like a noodle bowl. So this is one of my husband and I's favorites. So we talked about how instant noodles can be considered an ultra processed food. So one thing that you can do if you want to make your instant noodles a little bit more on the nutritious side is instead of using the seasoning packet that it comes with, maybe you can just use a carton of broth that you get at the grocery store and add a little dash of soy sauce to it.
You got to watch out for those seasoning packets. They are high in sodium content.
They are. So you could even use half the packet too if you wanted to, or you can use some other broth that you get from the grocery store. And then to add some nutritious ingredients to it, you could throw in a handful of spinach. We like to crack an egg into it, and the egg kind of poaches, and it's almost like this nice noodle bowl with a poached egg in it.
Okay.
And then some other ideas are adding maybe some frozen edamame. And then you can even add frozen veggies, like some frozen broccoli, straight into the boiling water.
Okay.
So that way the veggie, the broccoli, the frozen broccoli just cooks along with the noodles. So those are some of my favorite fast, easy meals that are more minimally processed and are good alternatives to fast food that are going to be more nutritious for us, while also in many cases less expensive.
No, these all sound great to me. So I'm definitely going to try some of these. So it takes just a little bit of planning ahead, obviously. So if you it's worth the time on your schedule to map out, because then when you're driving around looking for a fast food place to go, in order to take that time, reallocate it to planning ahead at home.
Right.
And you can get some great meals.
Right. Absolutely. Or compare that to a food delivery service
where
you're paying the processing fee, the tip, the delivery fee, you're paying all this. And before you know it, you've spent $30 and it's only one meal that originally was $10.
You can eat lunch for a week off that if you go this way. Absolutely. So talking about healthy alternatives, an obvious thing that comes to mind are plant-based. So plant-based meat substitutes, are they ultra-processed?
They are most of the time considered ultra-processed.
Okay. Oh, that's too bad, right?
But, I think that there's some room for flexibility here. So what I usually tell people with the plant-based meat substitutes is just like how you probably wouldn't eat a burger every day, don't have one of these plant-based, burgers every single day of the week, right? It's okay to have, if you want to have this on a Saturday, like that's okay. It's all about balance, but maybe you just don't eat it every single day of the week.
Well, it's the trap of, it's healthy, so I can eat it whenever I want. Well,
it is still considered a highly processed food. Yeah. So some great alternatives to that would be doing tempeh, edamame, lentils, or even tofu. Tofu is one of those foods that's kind of more in the middle. It is a processed food, but it doesn't have a really long ingredient list. It's the edamame beans with some salt and usually some kind of calcium. That's another alternative that's going to be way less processed than a plant-based protein meat ground, for example.
Hearing a lot of avocado and edamame in these conversations too, which is great because I like both of those things. So I'm encouraged by this conversation. This is good stuff.
Good.
So when we're out there buying groceries, looking at labels, right? What can we look for on a label to alert us if something is ultra processed or not? Like a very basic description I read is if it's wrapped in plastic and it has at least one ingredient you wouldn't usually find in your kitchen, like you were saying, it's probably an ultra processed food.
Yeah. And this is where it is difficult, right? Because we said it's a continuum and we said there's foods that are kind of in the middle. So what I usually look for to identify an ultra-processed food is usually it has that longer ingredient list. Usually it's going to have more than like 4 ingredients. And usually it's going to have things like stabilizers, colors, emulsifiers, these things that we don't typically have in our kitchen. And one thing I want to highlight again is that these things are not necessarily bad, right? The emulsifier, I'm not saying that's the bad thing in that food. It's usually the ultra-processed food as a whole. So it's not necessarily those additives that are making it bad for us is what I'm trying to say. It's the fact that it's ultra-processed is usually where the problem comes in.
Right.
It's not to say that we can't have these foods. We just want to make them a smaller footprint on our overall diet.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much for being back on the podcast with us here, Amanda.
Absolutely.
So, Kim, unfortunately, a lot of the things I eat or like to eat are ultra-processed foods, as we found out talking to Amanda.
like I said, it's inescapable.
Mhm.
They're everywhere. And, even some of the things that we might suggest, like whole grain bread, they might have some of those ingredients that might technically make it more processed or
Mhm.
more ultra processed, but it's still whole grain bread. So maybe you should still get it. And I think it just goes to show that there's the spectrum that she talked about, that you really have to make decisions for yourself about what you're willing to eat versus, maybe those corn chips with the flavor additives
So
or
good.
whatever.
They're so good.
Those might not be the best choice, but if your whole grain bread might have a few ingredients that make it ultra processed, maybe that's the better choice.
Yeah, like I told her in our conversation, I think we all know this is probably not the healthiest thing we should be eating. Now, there is a lot of gray areas sometimes, and that's where it's tricky. Like granola bars, like that is fool's gold when it comes to this is healthy, right? No, it's not actually. Like if something is sustainable for this expires in 2 years, that's probably not going to be the best thing to be eating on a regular basis, right?
Yeah, and I thought another point where there's so much in this about marketing. So I think some processed foods have emerged because we don't want the unhealthy ultra processed foods. We want our healthier processed foods that might have like protein chips or, whatever. So it has like this health halo. I can eat my chips and they're healthy for me because I'm getting all this protein.
Yeah, the mental aspect of it, or even the sociological aspect of it, really, of like, you need this, or this is going to help you here. We talked about that, and there is a silver lining to every cloud here. And I think what might help is, the fast foods, the fast casuals, as Amanda put it, foods, they're getting more expensive, right? So if you do these swaps that we were talking about, not only is it healthier, it's probably going to save you money and time.
Yeah, for certain. And, I think what I liked about what Amanda shared is that I think it's safe to say you're never really going to be able to fully eliminate these from your diet. It's just impractical. But I think finding ways to make healthier choices in this very imperfect system is important. And I know for myself, it's like to avoid just getting on an app and ordering food delivery. Like if I keep certain simple things around, like boxed mac and cheese, and, I'll get the one with the healthier health halo or whatever, and make that. Steam my frozen broccoli, steam some frozen peas, throw that all in there. Maybe like throw in like a can of beans or something. That's healthier than what I was going to order on my food delivery app.
Right.
So, finding ways to make it work for you. I loved her approach.
Yeah, I love the idea of like preparing these, be it like burrito boxes or Mediterranean boxes or poke bowls, right?
Yes.
I think those are great options and alternatives to like going and getting a burger and fries and a shake, as appealing as that might sound. These are also good and fulfilling.
I think that's one of the things, right? Because ultra processed foods do tend to be the cheaper foods. And so if you're on a limited budget, have limited time, you're going to try to go for those foods sometimes. And so like, how can you be adding more nutrition to them is always key.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of On Health with Houston Methodist. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We drop episodes Tuesday mornings. So until next time, stay tuned and stay healthy.